A warm welcome to everyone. By the sounds of it, it's quite warmy weather outside as well. So I hope the spirits are filled with that sunny warmth wherever you are. So welcome to today, where we are going to be looking at Judas, Thomas, and the valleys of the Holy Land. We have Jared Goldfarb, who will be literally exploring the valleys or lowlands of the Holy Land with us today, and then also reflect perhaps on the significance that they play in scriptures. And thereafter, we're going to have Father JP and Stephanie Saldana, who will lead us in the spiritual reflection of how we understand the valleys in our spiritual life and the road to Pentecost. So just following on from last week and then for the things to come. So hearty welcome. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Father John Paul. Father John Paul, you're just on mute. Yeah.
Welcome to each and every one of you. Thank you for being part of this program of the Way to Pentecost, done in partnership with Tantur Ecumenical Institute and the Ignatian Spirituality Community out of Geneva. And so with me is Stephanie Saldana, and watching somewhere is Frederick Masson. We really appreciate your joining with us. We really appreciate the fact too, your support for this type of program. In Jerusalem today, as I understand in Glasgow and in Geneva, it's quite sunny. It's very warm, very summery here in Jerusalem. And yet I also understand it's a rainy season in Kenya. So welcome to all of you throughout the world. And with that, Jared, you've got lots of little pearls of wisdom to share with us.
I certainly hope so. Greetings, everyone. Good day, good morning, good evening, and good night all over the world. It's so wonderful to see so many people from so far away, and even some folks from just up the street, JP and Stephanie. So it's nice to see familiar faces from last week and to be able to join you again from Jerusalem. As Petra mentioned, I'm going to take a look today at how the valleys, as well as maybe a little bit of the hills, play a role in our spiritual narratives, in connecting us maybe to the text that we know so well. And hopefully, like we did last week, we'll be able to expand our knowledge, our understanding, and our connections to these stories to enhance the moments that we yearn to celebrate, especially at a time like this, when many of us, no matter how much we would like to walk in the Holy Land, are perhaps unable to, at least for the time being. We're working on that, and that will change soon, and I look forward to seeing you all in Jerusalem. Just as before, we have a brief time to share together, and so I want to dig right in and take a look at some texts and some images, and specifically try to understand how the topography of the Holy Land might inform our relationship with this place. And of course, we're going to begin with the stories that are most relevant right now to the period of Pentecost, of course. So I'm going to share my screen. And I'll turn my camera back on so you can see my adorable face. And here we go. Okay, so hopefully you're all looking at my title page here. The first kind of inkling, the first thought I had when I was asked to present on this particular topic was from Psalm 130. As you can see here on the screen, out of the depths I call to you, O Lord. Mima'amakim karaticha Adonai. Something that's just, I don't know, is always spoken to me. And I think you'll see how that resonates a little bit for me personally and in general as we proceed along. So as I said, we're going to take a look at biblical topography as a metaphor, perhaps, for our spiritual journey. And we'll begin with, of course, the obvious text. My apologies, JP and Stephanie, if you're going to go over this in more detail later. I won't make much of it now, but just as a foundation for our journey in the Holy Land today, of course, we need to have a basis. So from Acts chapter 1, we read that in those days, Peter stood up among the believers. Together, the crowd numbered about 120 persons, and said, "Friends, the scripture had to be fulfilled, which the Holy Spirit, through David, foretold concerning Judas, who became a guide for those who arrested Jesus. For he was numbered among us and was allotted his share in this ministry. Now this man acquired a field with the reward of his wickedness, and falling headlong, he burst open in the middle, and all his bowels gushed out. This became known to all the residents of Jerusalem, so that the field was called in their language, Hakel Dama, field of blood." So I'm guessing that you are all extremely familiar with this text. Obviously, that's one of the reasons why you've joined us today. But we're going to take a look at a different aspect of it than I assume most of us do when we relate to this text, especially in a spiritual vein, and certainly within any ritual context. And so I wanted to focus specifically on this notion of the field, right? What does it mean when we understand that Judas, after this very kind of chaotic moment of the arrest of Jesus and the persecution of Jesus, eventually the crucifixion, the resurrection that we looked at last week, and now it's sort of there's a postscript where Judas seems to be paying a price for the role that he plays in this story. I don't want to deal with the text any further than that, other than to just understand that I would like to try to examine this connection between the sort of the role that Judas takes on and his fate, right? This moment of shame, essentially, that he has to embody, or that he does embody, as his life ends in the field of blood, literally Hakel Dama in Aramaic, the field of blood. So how might we understand this field of blood? Is there any kind of context that we can use to appreciate this particular moment? And for that, as I often do, and I did last week, I want to go back a little bit, perhaps to some of our early textual narratives, and maybe understand this notion of valley and the roles that the valleys will play, and particularly how a valley might then imply or even accentuate the existence of, and therefore the role of, the hill in our religious traditions, especially, of course, here in the Holy Land. So let's go back to an early text from the 5 books of Moses, the Torah. And in Deuteronomy chapter 11, we read the following, just to give a little bit of a framing of this text. Of course, this is the retelling of the Torah, right? Deuteronomy, literally, just as the Israelites were about to cross over from the quote-unquote wilderness into the promised land. And there's a rehashing of much of the legal material, the mitzvot, the commandments that have been passed down from God through Moses to the Israelites. And here we have a very particular moment that is relating to the land to which they are about to cross. So follow along with me here in Deuteronomy chapter 11. Keep every commandment that I command you today, so that you may have the strength to enter and take possession of the land that you are about to cross into and possess, and that you may long endure upon the soil that God swore to your fathers to give to them and to their heirs a land flowing with milk and honey. For the land that you are about to enter and possess is not like the land of Egypt, from which you have come. There, the grain you sowed had to be watered by your own labor, like a vegetable garden. But the land you are about to cross into and possess, a land of hills and valleys, soaks up its water from the rains of heaven. Now, of course, for me as a Jew, the emphasis of this particular text, as we learn explicitly a few verses later, is that the concept of commandment, of mitzvah, of some sort of sacred relationship between human and God is going to become reliant upon the relationship between heaven and earth, right? Meaning, a couple of verses later, we read that those who observe these commandments, when the due season comes, God will make it rain. And so unlike in Egypt, which is largely a kind of an area of flat plains with a great river running through it, that you can simply move at your whim to be able to grow whatever you need to sustain your community. Here in this land, we learn, and the Israelites will soon experience, there is very little water present on the ground. You need it to fall from the heavens, and that becomes one of the foundations of the relationship between human and God. Humans do as God expects, and then God in return does as humans expect by making it rain. And so the land is going to reflect that relationship between heaven and earth by perhaps being formed as hills and valleys, as we read here, harim uvkaot, right? A har, a mountain or a hill, and a beka or baka, which is a valley or a crack, literally, in the earth. So already, just as we're even about to enter this land, before 99.9% of the stories that are going to evolve out of this previous or early narrative, we are introduced to it as a land of hills and valleys. And so I want to explore that together. How is that going to play out, and how will it inform the relationship that we establish with all of these building texts and narratives? So let's dig deeper a little bit into the layers. You'll remember last week that I showed you this image of the topography of the Holy Land. We don't need to go into it again, but just to remind you, now that we've looked at the text in Deuteronomy, that of course we are very much anticipating this notion of hill and valley, the highlands, the lowlands, and as we saw last week, the intermediate lands. Remember, we were talking about the Shephelah, the central area here. We're going to today focus mostly on the high country, perhaps because it's in the high country that the valleys that exist perhaps become a little bit more accentuated. And of course, because the intensities of the stories that we tell only increases in the highlands, given that that becomes the backbone of not just the sacred land, but also of the ever-evolving narrative, right? Meaning the stories of Jerusalem and of Bethlehem and the hills of the Galilee, all along this, what we often refer to as the spine of the land of Israel, of the Holy Land. So we're going to focus in specifically on the area of Jerusalem. And here now I'm showing you a topographical map of our dear city, my home sweet home. And we are looking at the center of the city of Jerusalem. Those of you with a keen eye for topography can already perhaps identify that right here, we are looking at the sacred hill, the epicenter, if you will, of the three monotheistic narratives and traditions in Jerusalem, right here on what today we might refer to as the Temple Mount or Haram Asharif. It has many wonderful names, but right here would be that sacred space. And you can make out how it is quite naturally formed or accentuated by various valleys around it. If I were to add on a little bit more visual, you can probably now see how the topography essentially has been able to provide us with strategic importance of the hilltop, of natural contours of our city, and even the economy of Jerusalem, i.e. markets versus agriculture. And so if you look carefully at where some of these walls are located, you are able to see how those hills and valleys in particular are able to play a role in the definition of the city of Jerusalem. So this is really important to be able to appreciate. And now essentially we want to dig back into our story of Hakel Dama, right? The field of blood where Judas meets his fate. And so here is a beautiful, beautiful image of the monastery of Hakel Dama, which is literally just a 5-minute walk from my home. I live just around the corner from this area here. As you can see, the monastery itself, right, as beautiful as it is actually kind of perched up a little high. It doesn't look like it's situated in a field, but in fact, it was built there because it overlooks the actual field, right?
Gary, we're not seeing anything.
You're not seeing anything. Oh, that's interesting. What are you seeing?
White screen.
Oh, well, that's funny because I'm looking at a beautiful picture of a monastery. That's very odd. Wait, let me try to advance. Oh, now I see you were on the texts. Oh, wait, we have imagery. That's very strange. Okay, well, so now I know if it doesn't appear, thank you very much, JP. Just let me know again, and I'll just fiddle with the buttons until the image appears. Sorry about that, folks, but now you can see what I was talking about. The monastery just down the street from my house is kind of built onto the side of the hill that overlooks what we call Hakel Dama, or the field of blood. And the question essentially that I want to ask is, how might we know that the story that we read in the first chapter of the Acts of the Apostles takes place in this particular field, given that Hakel Dama isn't really given much more kind of geographical information in our textual tradition? So one thing that we can do is take a look at the region around Hakel Dama, the valley itself. This is the valley that the monastery overlooks. I couldn't find or get a perfect picture that had both the monastery and the valley, go figure, in the same picture. So the monastery is just over to the left side of your screen here. And we are looking down into this valley that we're referring to as Hakel Dama, the field of blood, but it also has another name, a name that is probably far more used in the Jerusalem context, especially by visitors to the city, and many of you might even know it well. It is referred to as the Valley of Hinnom, the Valley of Hinnom, or the Son of Hinnom, depending on which textual reference you might be using. Gay Hinnom or Gay Ben Hinnom, the Valley of Hinnom. And this is the sort of wider topographical context of the field of blood. And maybe by taking a look at this valley, we can try to understand a little bit more about the placement of the story of Judas. Why is it that our traditions believe that the field of blood is located here? So for this, of course, we need more textual references. So now we're going to take a look at 2 Chronicles, chapter 28, in order to learn a little bit about the Valley of Hinnom. So we're going to find ourselves now going back somewhere in the vicinity of about 2,600 years ago, during the time of the temple standing in Jerusalem. And we read here that Ahaz, who was the king, Ahaz was 20 years old when he became king, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. He did not do what was pleasing to God as his father David had done, but he followed the ways of the kings of Israel. He even made molten images for the Baalim. He made offerings in the valley of Ben Hinnom and burned his sons in fire in the abhorrent fashion of the nations which God had dispossessed before the Israelites. He sacrificed and made offerings at the shrines on the hills and under every leafy tree. The Lord his God delivered him over to the king of Aram, who defeated him and took many of his men captive and brought them to Damascus. He was also delivered over to the king of Israel, who inflicted a great defeat on him. So, of course, the immediate fact that jumped out at us is that Ahaz was not a good king. He was a very bad boy. Why? Because he did exactly what God told him not to do, which apparently put him in very good company. There were lots of Israelites that were doing what God told them not to do, but Ahaz, as the king of Jerusalem, was doing it specifically in his neighborhood, i.e., a valley located just outside of the city of Jerusalem, the valley of Ben Hinnom, right? And so in the image that I showed you before, and that hopefully you can now see, this is the valley of Hinnom, which borders the city. When I say city, of course, I mean ancient Jerusalem, not today, which is a much greater, expansive city. But ancient Jerusalem, this valley borders it to the south and to the west. I'm going to show you another map in just a second for those who are perhaps orientationally challenged. So in 2 Chronicles, we read that the valley of Hinnom was a place where Ahaz, perhaps many others, were making offerings to the foreign gods, i.e., not the God of the Israelites, as well as burning his son in fire, perhaps a reference to this notion of child sacrifice, right? We all know part of the birth of monotheism was steering away from the religious practices of the other communities in the land of Canaan, one of which we read about, certainly in our textual tradition, was the sacrifice of children, something that very early on in our monotheistic narrative, we are going to be told to turn away from. And if you're not immediately envisioning the reference that I'm making, don't worry, because we're going to come back to that a little bit later. So here we have Ahaz in the Hinnom Valley making foreign sacrifices and perhaps even engaging in child sacrifice. So I want to give one more textual reference before we come back to the maps and to the geography, and that is in 2 Kings. This is sort of a resolution, you could say, for the horror of the activity of King Ahaz, and this is going to happen just a generation or two later. So here in 2 Kings chapters 22 and 23, I skipped around a little bit. You'll notice all of the ellipses, just to give you a taste of what's going on, and of course, to focus on the references to the topography. So read along with me. Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. He did what was pleasing to God, and he followed all the ways of his ancestor David. He did not deviate to the right or to the left. The king went up to the house of God together with all the men of Judah and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and the priests and the prophets, all the people, young and old. Then the king ordered the high priest Hilkiah, the priests of the second rank, and the guards of the threshold to bring out of the temple of God all the objects made for Baal and Asherah and all the host of heaven. He burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron, and he removed the ashes to Beit El. He brought out the image of Asherah from the house of God to the Kidron Valley outside Jerusalem, and he burned it in the Kidron Valley. He beat it to dust and scattered its dust over the burial ground of the common people. He also defiled Tophet, which is in the valley of Ben Hinnom, so that no one might consign his son or daughter to the fire of Molech. And the king tore down the altars made by the kings of Judah on the roof by the upper chamber of Ahaz, and the altars made by Menashe in the two courts of the house of God. He removed them quickly from there and scattered their rubble in the Kidron Valley. So in 2 Kings, not only do we have a follow-up reference to the Valley of Ben Hinnom, right, making a clear connection to this area of child sacrifice so that no one would be able to offer their children to Molech, this foreign god, but we also have the addition of another valley to kind of enhance the story of the topography of Jerusalem. And this, of course, is a valley that is very well known, I assume, to most of you, especially if you've been here in Jerusalem, and that is the Kidron Valley, which is going to border Jerusalem to the east. And what do we learn about these valleys? Specifically, that they seem to be the place where we either defile our traditions or we, in removing that defilement or that forbidden act from our midst, we cast them down into the valleys, right? So Hinnom and Kidron become those places of depth, of darkness, of evil. And so by perhaps treating those valleys in the textual fashion as kind of a no man's land, perhaps we are elevating the role that the hill is going to play. So, of course, let's take a look at some of the images. Now, here is the Kidron Valley. This, again, might be very familiar to many of you, just outside the eastern wall, which you can see here up on the right. Let me just double check to make sure that are you seeing yes, you are seeing the picture. That is wonderful. So just outside of this eastern wall, you might recognize this gate, for example, is the famous Golden Gate or the Gate of Mercy, leading directly onto the Temple Mount or the Haram. And here we have this gorgeous green valley with lots of olive trees. Today, of course, we have a much more romantic relationship with the valley than perhaps existed during the time of the kings of Israel, when things were being cast down into the valley, should litter our midst or defile our sacred spaces. So if we are to combine now the Kidron Valley and the Hinnom Valley, right, let us go back now to this topographic image. Oops, hold on. I see it's not appearing on your screen yet. Let's see if we can jog it into place. There we go. Apologies for the technical difficulties. I'm not sure it's showing up on my screen right away, but for some reason not on your screens. So here we have the same topographic map that we saw before. Here again is the heart and soul of the Jerusalem experience, the Temple Mount, and we see some valleys around. And if we were to add some names to those valleys, my guess is you'll find them a little bit familiar. Here on the eastern side, of course, note the orientation up here. This is not looking up towards north, but rather north is facing to our right. So the Kidron Valley, which is on the bottom of our map, is actually on the eastern side of the city. And here we have the Hinnom Valley, which is flanking the south and snaking around to the west. Okay, which eventually forms a companion hill to the sacred mount, and one that we refer to in later times as Mount Zion, right? Mount Zion. You will notice that Mount Zion and what here is called Mount Moriah, a name that we'll reference in a few moments. There is another valley called the Tyropoeon Valley. This is a name provided to us by the historian Josephus 2,000 years ago. We're not exactly sure where the name comes from and why. Most scholars believe it was probably a mistake in either understanding or translation, but it is, of course, what gives us the name, the Valley of the Cheesemakers. Nonetheless, we're not going to focus on that, but I simply wanted you to see, now we combine all of our images, the topography, the valleys, and the walls of the ancient city of Jerusalem, and you can see that they really help us understand how this city functions. We have the high places, right? Zion, Moriah, and we have the low places, the valleys that kind of cut between them and help define them. Okay? So with the stories of Hinnom and Kidron, right? Perhaps not the most flattering of imagery, and the complement to the high places, the places that we're trying to purify, the places in which we're trying to honor the God tradition. We are now faced with a bit of a juxtaposition, right? High versus low, sacred versus evil, permitted versus forbidden. I want to reorient our map for a second and share with you what becomes a bit of a cartographic midrash, if you will, right? Meaning using the map, using the spatial reality of Jerusalem in order to tell another level of the story. My guess is a lot of you can recognize the satellite image that is hopefully now on your screen. Let me just make sure. Is it showing? Nope, it is not showing yet. There we go. Yep, okay. So this is a satellite image, of course, of the core of the city of Jerusalem, what today we would simply call the Old City. And you can probably make out the gold dome right here where my mouse is on top of the Temple Mount / Haram Asharif. Here we have the very dense Old City of Jerusalem. And for those of you with very keen eyes, you might be able to start making out some of the valleys that help define the ancient city. So here on the west and the south is the Hinnom Valley, right? Where we understand the location of Hakel Dama, the field of blood, to be from our first text in the Acts of the Apostles. Here on the eastern side of Jerusalem, of course, is the Kidron Valley, which many of you probably have experienced if you've been to visit the city of David, for example, or the famous Gihon Spring, the ancient water source that fed the city of Jerusalem. Those are located in the Kidron Valley. And as we saw in the last image, we added in the Tyropean Valley, right? So that you have, oops, hold on. Please give me the Tyropean Valley. I see that the imagery is not coming across on your screens yet. Perhaps it's just a bit of a time lapse. So if you hold on 1 second and we will try again and hopefully make the valleys appear so that I can complete the midrash. Otherwise, it lacks a certain visual appreciation. All right, we got 2 out of 3. And for some reason, we are not. There we go. Okay. Whew. So you are now seeing the Hinnom Valley on the left, the Kidron Valley on the right, and the Tyropean Valley in the middle. You can see quite clearly that because of the Tyropean Valley, we are able to perhaps understand the specific accent, right, or the definition of this sacred hill here. The Tyropean Valley is actually what helps carve out that hill. Today, of course, we don't notice the valley as much because the intensity of our relationship with that hill has caused us to build, and it literally fill in that entire valley. But for any of you that have been to the Western Wall, for example, of the Temple Mount, you are literally standing in the Tyropean Valley. Now, if you take a look at the shape that these 3 valleys form as they define the contours of ancient Jerusalem, you might notice they take on the image of a Hebrew letter. Now, I'm a little hesitant to take this to its end in terms of the midrashic explanation, because it's a little out there, but I kind of like it because it's going to help us understand where we as humans have tried to understand the relationship between valley and hill. And so for those of you that know a little bit of Hebrew, you might recognize the letter Shin. The letter Shin. The letter Shin could stand for a lot of things, but many people know it from the image of the mezuzah, which will hopefully appear on your screen in just a moment due to the delay. Hold on. Oh my God, this is quite frustrating. All right, perhaps you will not see the image of the mezuzah, which is not at all critical, but on almost every mezuzah that you would see on a doorpost of a Jewish home or a Jewish institution, as one enters and leaves, there is a little scroll that is usually attached to the doorpost. The word mezuzah, of course, means doorpost, and that mezuzah is the literal manifestation of the commandments. I'm just going to continue to try to get that mezuzah back on your screen. The manifestation of the commandment to inscribe the words of God upon the doorpost of your house and upon your gates. And the reason why we often see the Hebrew letter shin on a mezuzah is because shin stands for one of the many names of God, Shaddai, El Shaddai. Shaddai, of course, meaning breast in Hebrew. And the breast could be very much a symbol of strength, of nurturing, of maternity, right? It could stand for a lot of different things. But in one Hebrew tradition, the shin could also, Shaddai could also be an acronym for the Hebrew phrase Shomer Dlatot Yisrael, meaning guardian of the doorways of Israel, right? El Shaddai, a form of God's name that you will see over and over again in the textual tradition, the guardian of the doorways of Israel. So how do we use this in a very midrashic sense if we're to tell a rather creative story about the topography of Jerusalem? The valleys essentially show us God protecting Jerusalem. And in fact, we could even relate to the real fact on the ground that the valleys protect Jerusalem, right? How many battle texts or traditions of conflict do we associate with Jerusalem that include mentions of certain topographic realities, right? Who's on the hill looking down on the enemy? Who's in the valley, perhaps taking advantage of water sources? This is very much a part of the Jerusalem tradition. And so we see here how the valleys have come to sort of define our spiritual relationship with Jerusalem. I want to now start to wrap up, and in doing so, kind of expand out into a little bit more of a meta look at this issue of the topography of Jerusalem. And in order to do so, I want to take that image that we just saw on the screen of the shin. Oh, now you're seeing the mezuzah after I'm done talking about it. And so you see this notion, this image of the three valleys that are, textually speaking, places of darkness, of lowness, of distance from sanctity, but perhaps leading us to maybe look up to the hills to see El Shaddai, to see the guardian of the doorways of Israel, to see the place on high where we meet God and relate to God. And of course, for me, what else could this represent than Psalm 121, which I'm sure you all know well, but we'll read it through really quickly. Actually, since you all know it so well, I'm going to read it through in Hebrew and you can follow along in the English. Shir lama'alot, esa enai el harim, me'ayin yavo Ezri. Ezri me'im Adonai, ose shamayim va'aretz. El yiten al yiten lamut raglecha, al yanum shomrecha. Hine lo yanum velo yishan shomer Yisrael. Adonai shomrecha, Adonai tzilcha, al yad yeminecha. Yomam hashemesh lo yakeka v'yareach balayla. Adonai yishmarcha mikol ra, yishmor et nafshecha. Adonai yishmor tzedcha uvoacha me'ata ve'ad olam. Notice not only is Psalm 121 begin a song for ascents, right, for going up, but it is also about looking up. Esa enai, I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where am I standing if I'm lifting up my eyes? Perhaps in a valley. Perhaps I am in a dark place. I am tempted by all of these notions that we experience in our religious traditions of defiling God, of crossing to the dark side and transgressing even our closest friends, our teachers, our rabbis, perhaps like in the Judas story. Notice also in Psalm 121, the constant mention of the word guardian and guard, right? The same exact root of the word Shaddai, Shomer, Dlatot Israel, the guardian of the doors of Israel. So definitely one of the more beautiful texts that help us see and really feel how the topography plays a role in. And now to wrap up, one final very, very quick story. And that is that if we're already talking about lifting up our eyes, there is really, I have one favorite text, and any of you that have been with me in Jerusalem probably know my favorite text because I talk about it a lot, and it also happens to be quite relevant to where I live in the city, and that is Genesis 22. Well, this is a far cry, perhaps, from the imagery and the understanding that we want to glean from the text that we started with in the books of Apostles. I'm going to trust that JP and Stephanie and all of you are very adequately going to be able to address the spiritual meaning of those texts. And I want to wrap up with just a quick look at Genesis 22. And we read here, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. God said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. Offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains, which I will tell you. And Abraham rose up early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and broke the wood for the burnt offering, rose up, and went to the place which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place far away. And in the tradition of visiting Jerusalem and trying to put place to text and make the connection, and I see once again we're struggling here with the image. Please, please, please show the picture. Well, I wanted to end with a beautiful view. There we go, of my backyard in Jerusalem. This is the southern ridge of the city of Jerusalem, known as the Tayelet, or the promenade. Looking north, some of you may be able to make out the Dome of the Rock inside the ancient city of Jerusalem on top of the sacred hill, known here perhaps as Har Moriah or Mount Moriah. And in Genesis 22, when we read that on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and he sees that he is standing on this ridge overlooking the valley of Hinnom and the Kidron Valley over here to the east, what essentially define the place where Abraham is about to journey in order to make very concrete and very sacred this relationship between him and God. And so it's with this image that I'll end, as we have started with perhaps a vague geographic mention of Hakel Dama, the field of blood, tying it to the Hinnom Valley, linking the Hinnom to the Kidron, understanding how they help define Jerusalem as a sacred hill. And finally here, we're ending with this notion of perhaps it's only from a valley, a place of darkness, a place of questioning, that we can look up, we can lift our eyes, like we read in the Psalms, like we read in Genesis, as with the story of Abraham, in order to look for inspiration from God and find it in the land, not just in the text, not just in our spiritual beings, but literally find that inspiration in the land of Israel. Okay, thank you very much. I want to stop there and allow my friends JP and Stephanie to take over.
Yeah, just before we go with Father JP and Stephanie, Jared, just one question.
Sure, please.
That came in. The field of blood, or the field of Judas, how does that relate to Judas? Was that where he retreated or where he died? And if so, also, why is it not on the itinerary of the Holy Land places that we go and visit?
Well, the first question is a little bit easier than the second one. The tradition, at least as far as that I'm familiar with, and feel free anybody else to pipe in with other traditions, is that at least from, let's say, a few centuries following the life or the time of Jesus, there is a tradition that the field of blood, which is where essentially Judas meets his fate, right? He dies. It is often understood as a form of suicide. He is perhaps laden with guilt at the act that he has committed. And so while the text sort of makes it sound like he falls and breaks himself open, many have told the story as if he literally throws himself on the rocks in order to end his life. There is no geographic hint in the text, so we don't really know where it is. But like I said, a number of centuries after the time of Jesus, there are traditions that begin to put that field of blood in the southern valley of Jerusalem, the valley that is known as Hinnom. So that is where we see the overlap, you could say, of those two stories. There really are no sites to visit in the field. Many people go by the field, make mention of the field, but one of the reasons why a lot of folks don't perhaps stop and make much of the field or the valley itself is largely because there's very little to see there, and simply because there is so much more to see elsewhere in Jerusalem. So I don't think it's an issue of avoiding the field, but rather focusing on the endless amount of stories and narratives that perhaps occupy a priority in understanding our relationship with Jerusalem.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jared.
Sure.
So with that, over to Father John Paul and Stephanie.
I would follow that up, Jared, with just simply saying too, that as you drive along through there, as you just said, there's not a whole lot to see. It's not a very scenic area. In fact, it's kind of run down, at least from what I recall with it. But I want to pick up on where Jared left off. It was an excellent segue, with the valleys being the places where there was a certain sense of darkness, of questioning, maybe a sense of despair, or struggle or turmoil. So here we're looking east of Jerusalem, is the Wadi Kelt. And to me, it really symbolizes, just the depths of the valleys, but also the wilderness. I think some of the images that Jared showed to us, and maybe even just in some of our reading or imaginations or in movies or books or whatever, valleys, it can be quite beautiful, surrounded by peaks. They can be lush, they can be very peaceful. And yet, as Jared mentioned, they can also be places of that darker, the deep recesses, the harshness of land as well. Psalm 23, I always love because it talks about, yes, even though I walk through a dark valley, or some translations, talk about a valley of the shadow of death, there is God at my side, with his rod and his staff. And in the sight of all my foes, he banquets me. Well, to be in the sight of the foes, yes, if the foes are up above looking down, I always like to think that maybe somehow being led with that rod and the staff is being led out of the valley to a hilltop where everyone can look up and see the fact that we are banqueted. Psalm 1, the psalm that Jared began with, out of the depths I cry to you, is such an important thing. Out of the depths, the valleys. Another valley image in scripture that really has always caught my attention is Ezekiel, where Ezekiel is caught up by the Spirit of the Lord and transported to a valley, and sometimes the translation says a plain, but it's being brought to this deep valley that's filled with bones, very dry bones. And Ezekiel is asked, can these bones ever come to life again? So I think it becomes just a great image again of a certain darkness and despair. Isaiah 40 talks about this wonderful thing, let the valleys be raised and the hills be lowered, so that everything becomes a level road. It talks about that day of the Lord, that somehow things will balance out. So what I also see in Wadi Kelt is that it's also a place where you can see St. George's Monastery, because it's a place where people go into these valleys, into the wilderness. I like to think of it in terms of a spiritual context, that the importance of us going into those deep valleys of our lives, of our hearts, of our minds, of our beings. And these monks go there because there they know that somehow they will discover something. And maybe it's just the sense of a God, of looking up and recognizing in the depths of our being, we will find and experience a God who lifts us up. And so I want to go back to another image, which is not shown here, but it's one that we showed over the last couple of weeks. It's the image of Jesus rising from the dead. And so he's standing above a coffin, and he's lifting up Adam and Eve. And in many of these icons, under that coffin, you'll see a skeleton that's wrapped up in chains, because it somehow represents now it is death that is being held captive, rather than death holding us captive. And so for me, that valley and the image of the valleys and the mountaintops is really one of resurrection. It's one of Jesus lifting us up, calling us up out of the tombs. And so therefore the tombs is, we went through the garden of the tomb 2 weeks ago. Those tombs can be, or these deep, dark valleys, can be psychological valleys or tombs, emotional tombs, spiritual tombs, but there's something real. And so that notion of dark valley, a valley of the shadow of death, valleys that cause us to look up and cry out, where will my help come from, are all important things. In the Byzantine tradition, today, this third Sunday of Easter, is the Sunday of the raising of the paralytic. And there's a couple of the raisings of the paralytics in scriptures. One of them was friends lowering a paralytic to the feet of Jesus. But another one is a paralytic, someone who for many, many years lies by the pool of the sheep pool, Bethesda, the pool, that pool that's kind of on that northeastern part of Jerusalem. And every once in a while, the waters of the pool were stirred, and whoever could get into those waters would be healed. And here's this man who's been laying there for years and years and years, and he just can't get to the waters, and no one is there to help him. And so on this third Sunday of the Easter season, in the Byzantine tradition, the Orthodox tradition, we really look and we just see, this paralytic is really kind of living in a deep valley, a valley of despair, a valley of darkness. And even though Jesus addresses him and says, your sins are forgiven, now get up and go home and take your pellet with you. We think that it's all about the whole thing of Jesus forgiving sins. I look upon it and say, no, it's really all about resurrection. It's Jesus entering into the depths of our valleys, into our darkness, and they're allowing us to feel that that's where the Lord wants to be with us, to transform all of that. And so it's another way of lifting up this paralytic out of a grave, out of a tomb, out of this deep valley. And in the spiritual exercises, Ignatius has us pray for shame and guilt. And it's always kind of an interesting thing, but shame and guilt, I think, are very much a part of that dark valley, that dark, the tombs that we can live in. It's part of where we really experience our sin, our unlovableness. And there Jesus goes. It's almost, in our creed and in our traditions, when Jesus dies and lays in the tomb, he goes into the depths. He goes into this hell, this darkness, and there, why? To lift up those longing for that help, to lift up Adam and Eve, the restoration into the garden. So it really is a parable, not so much about healing as it is resurrection, new life, and the power of love to bring forth life. Another example that I would use is Judas, who just simply could not believe in a love that could forgive even the worst things that he could have done, that being betrayal. And so it's a deep, dark valley of the shadows of death, where for Judas, it just seemed like all he could really see or experience there was death. And so a certain tragic figure. I think Thomas is also another important person to focus on in terms of a resurrection, a valley of struggle, maybe a certain darkness. Thomas being known as the doubter because he says, when others say we've experienced the resurrection of the Lord, his thing is, unless I put my hand in his side, unless I actually feel him, it's going to be hard for me to believe. And again, Jesus meets him where he is. Why? Because Jesus does not want people in despair. Jesus does not want people in the depths and the darkness of the valleys, but he really wants to help people who long for resurrection, who long for a new experience that gives forth life. In the Byzantine tradition too, Thomas is not really seen so much as a doubter, but as one whose desire is met by Jesus. I want to touch him. I want to experience the fullness of his resurrection. And part of some of the prayers that we use says something to the effect of, in Thomas reaching out and touching Jesus, how could his hands not be burned by the power of this light that rises, that causes Jesus to rise from the dead? And yet it says, because the Lord invited him, come touch my side. And so it really is kind of a resurrection experience to me. And Thomas becomes, from that, a great evangelizer. And so a question that I would simply present in following all of this, where do you long to touch this person, Jesus? What strengthens you in your experience of the resurrection? And I would end certainly my reflections with something that has become more and more over the past few years, something very strong in my understanding of the resurrection. The resurrection is not so much all about Jesus. It's not just about Jesus rising from the dead. It's about us. It's about us in the sense that God has plans of life for us, plans of hope, plans not of death, not of diminishment, but of lifting us up from kind of our deeper, dark valleys, where we struggle to believe, lifting us up from that because of a desire for us to have an experience of life through the power of his love. And so with that, I'll let Stephanie lead from here.
As we look now at this beautiful icon of Jesus washing the feet of the 12 disciples, you are probably struck, as I'm struck, by the image of Judas there without a halo. I wanted to talk a little bit just briefly about, in these last days, we've been talking about consolation, about these peak feelings we have when we can look back on our lives and feel God present with us in beauty, and we feel calm in those moments. But in these valley moments, we feel desolation, we feel cut off from God. And in the Judas text, we see somebody who presumably feels he cannot go back from what he's done. And yet, the text itself is extraordinary. Jesus washes the feet of Judas. A monk from Algeria, I'm particularly devoted to, Christian de Chergé, pointed this out, reminding us that we too should wash the feet of all who come. And just a few hours later, when Judas comes in the garden, Jesus calls him friend. There are many translations. Some say, friend, why are you here? Friend, why have you come? Friend, do what you have to do. But in every translation, friend is there. Jesus calls Judas friend. Despair or desolation is when we feel that there's no way back, that we're cut off from God's love. But God never wants us to be cut off. Jesus calls Judas his friend, not because he's being sarcastic, but because unto the last minute, Judas is Jesus's friend. In the same way that on the cross, Jesus says of the thieves beside him, he forgives them, and of the ones who kill him, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. We keep thinking that we've come to the limits of God's love, only to discover that God's love has no limits. In the same way, the temptation to despair doesn't end with the resurrection story. The Thomas story begins with a sign that says, Thomas, who was one of the 12, wasn't there when Jesus came, which means Thomas wasn't there when Jesus appeared. How horrible he must have felt that he was left out. Tempted to despair, he tells his friends, I won't believe until I touch his wounds. But as he says this aloud, presumably something happens. A week later, Jesus breaks through the closed door of his room, appearing to him and showing his wounds. Thomas touches them and is healed, and as we said, becomes an evangelist. Judas and Thomas, and Peter too. What different endings. What we do with our despair. Out of the depths I call to you, O Lord. All of us experience despair. But so often the first step out of our scariest place is admitting it out loud, giving voice to the frightening things inside of us, going to our valleys, admitting our doubts and admitting our fears, giving voice to them. So in this last slide, I think it beautifully shows what I think of as the contemplative life. Sometimes we move from shadows into light, and sometimes we choose to move from light into shadows. We prayerfully go to the scary places, into the valleys, knowing that God is with us, so that we can give voice to what is inside of us, so that we can be healed. So today I'll just end with 2 questions. The first question is, are there any spaces inside of us where we feel we can't be loved? Where we feel ashamed? Are there things we're afraid to bring God in our own prayer? Today's an opportunity to recognize those places and to name them, to hand them over to God, whose love has no limits. We are loved in that place, and we are known in that place. As the Teze song so beautifully says, nothing can ever come between us and the love of God. The second meditation is to think about how we feel when we think of the death of Judas. Do we think he got what he had coming for him? Are we glad to be rid of him? Or do we grieve the despair of one who thought that there was no way back? In this prayer, we might begin to recognize if we hold the seeds of judgment to some people in our lives, if we still hold bitterness, if we treat some people in the society as if they're unworthy of God's love. Are there people in our own lives who have hurt us so much that we've convinced ourselves there's no way back? Today's an invitation to heal ourselves of that pain, to remind ourselves not only that Jesus would have washed our feet, but that we are called to wash the feet of all those who enter into our lives. We should try to live in the world with the same unboundless love that never says, this one is undeserving of my time, my love, my service. I love this one, but not that one. I forgive this one, but not that one. Love one another as I have loved you. So the valleys invite us into the shadow spaces so that we might find God there waiting for us. And it also asks us to see if we have left anyone out of our circle of love and to invite them back in. This is a love only made possible by God. And yes, the valleys ask us to look up. Whoever has hiked in the valleys here knows there are most beautiful places. We bird watchers go there because that's where we get to see the birds who pass through.
So we end with the special thank you to Jared, especially for, I was very intrigued by the notion, you purify the mountaintops by throwing away down into the valley the stuff that has gotten in the way. But from the valleys, we look up, from whence will my help come? So thank you.
I just want to also say on behalf of the group, thank you to the wonderful trio, Jared, Father John Paul, and Stephanie, for showing that the topography of Jerusalem, the scripture readings, and then just looking at ourselves spiritually, how that all can tie, and looking from the valleys, but then looking up. That's the real opportunity for us, and there's real hope. So thank you very much for that. And a special thank you also to everyone for joining us today. And we'd love to have you join us again next week, where we're going out from the valleys, up the mountains to the transfiguration of Mount Tabor, and also the Mount of the Beatitudes. So we're going to really be going up again. So we'd love to have you all join. And Nizar Haloon will be leading us up the mountains. So wishing you all a blessed and good week ahead. And thank you again to each and every one of you for joining. With that, goodbye. Bye. God bless. Hi. Bye, Marie.